Okay, so welcome to the IEO virtual seminar series. People are trickling in, and this is our sixth installment this year of the seminar. I'm Helene Poirson. I'm an advisor at the Independent Evaluation Office of the IMF. This is a recorded meeting that will be posted on the IEO's website early next week. I'd like to ask everyone to make sure you are muted unless you're speaking. So after the speakers' presentations, we will have a time for general discussion where all of you who are participating are welcome to ask questions from our guest speakers or contribute in other ways to the discussion. The chat function will be open during the speaker's presentation, and you are welcome to put your names in the chat at any time if you'd like to ask a question, or at the end of the presentations, you can raise your virtual hands and I will call on you. So it's now my great pleasure to introduce our two distinguished guest speakers who will speak on the topic of transitioning to renewable energy, policy challenges and opportunities. This topic is relevant to many IMF member countries who are exploring ways to transition away from fossil fuels, to reduce their energy dependency, and to create a more resilient economy. Some of the policy approaches that countries have taken include subsidizing certain industries, such as electric vehicles, or enacting carbon prices. And our guest speakers today are going to talk about the complexities of successfully executing these policy actions, as well as the trends that we're seeing around the world and how momentum is catching on some of those trends, on some of those actions. So our first guest speaker, whom I'm very excited to welcome today at the IEO seminar, she used to work at the IMF in a previous life, is Elaine Buckberg. Elaine Buckberg is a PhD and a senior fellow at the Salata Institute for Climate and Sustainability at Harvard University. Previously, Elaine was chief economist of General Motors from 2018 to 2023. At General Motors, Elaine was responsible for assessing the impact of worldwide economic developments on General Motors Corporation and for providing advice on various competitive and economic policy issues. From 2013 to 2016, Elaine also served as Deputy Assistant Secretary for Policy Coordination in the Office of Economic Policy at the U.S. Treasury Department. She also worked in economic consulting at the Brattle Group and NERA Economic Consulting. She worked in finance at Morgan Stanley, and as I mentioned at the beginning, at the IMF. So Elaine brings a very broad, diverse background from government, from academia, and also from the private sector. And we're, again, very excited to have her today. Our second guest speaker today is Professor Catherine Wolfram. She is the William Barton Rogers Professor in Energy and a Professor of Applied Economics at the MIT Sloan School of Management. She previously served as the Cora Jane Flood Professor of Business Administration at the Haas School of Business at UC Berkeley. From March 2021 to October 2022, Professor Wolfram served as the Deputy Assistant Secretary for Climate and Energy Economics at the U.S. Treasury while on leave from UC Berkeley. Before leaving for government service, Professor Wolfram was the program director of the National Bureau of Economic Research's Environment and Energy Economics Program and a research affiliate at the Energy Institute at Haas. Before joining the faculty at Berkeley, she was an assistant professor of economics at Harvard. Professor Wolfram has published extensively on the economics of energy markets. Her work has analyzed rural electrification programs in the developing world, energy efficiency programs in the US, the effects of environmental regulations on energy markets, and the impact of privatization and restructuring in the US and UK. She's currently working on several projects at the intersection of climate, energy, and trade, including work on the impact of the EU Carbon Border Adjustment Mechanism on other countries such as Mozambique, policy spillovers from that mechanism, and border adjustments for methane emissions from the oil and gas sector. So I am extremely honored to welcome Professor Wolfram today because her work is really directly relevant to our topic, and we are very excited to have her insights and expertise. So without further ado, I will hand the floor now to Elaine. And Elaine, over to you. You have the mic and the screen.
Please tell me when you can successfully see my slides.
Yes.
Wonderful. And indeed, I am an IMF alum. I enjoyed starting my career there. And I'm very honored to be back to speak with all you, although, of course, it would be more fun in person. And today I'm going to talk about EVs and US industrial policy. So this will be a US centric view. And I'm happy to take any questions you have beyond that. So let's get this going. So first we'll talk, let me just frame us with industrial policy under the Biden administration with respect to EVs, which really arises both in IRA and the bipartisan infrastructure law. And the Biden administration used both carrots and sticks for EV adoption. So on the left-hand side, we have our carrots. In the IRA, most importantly, the clean vehicle tax credits for new, used, and commercial vehicles, which I'll really dive into, but there are also production tax credits for US critical mineral production and processing, grants to auto suppliers, and business tax credits, and actually individual ones for installing EV chargers. The bipartisan infrastructure law has actual funding for EV infrastructure to the tune of $7.5 billion. And on the stick side, regulatory policy was used to tighten the fuel economy and greenhouse gas regulations to compel automakers to drive the mix of vehicles they sell in each model year towards more fuel efficient ones in a way that could not be done without battery electric vehicles. And it continued to allow California to set tighter standards as it has done for decades. And then, of course, there were tariffs on EV imports and battery imports from China. And the clean vehicle tax credit really, and the new one in IRA, because it goes back all the way to the financial crisis, has threefold goals. And first, it's supporting the growth of promoting EV adoption for its climate benefits. So there's a climate angle, as well as the industrial policy angle of supporting growth of US EV manufacturing, automaking always sort of having outsized political influence, and preventing that EV manufacturing from being vulnerable to foreign control of supply chains. In other words, why spend federal money to achieve number two if you could be cut off along the supply chain by number three? And this is very much the Senator Joe Manchin ad that enabled this to be in IRA. It also, by setting a bunch of criteria, can make it less costly by restricting which vehicles are eligible. And the motivation for that really comes from this IEA graph, which shows you along the global EV battery supply chain how powerful the role of China is, which is, of course, red in this graph. And you can see that in mining, other than graphite, they're not dominant. But when you get to processing, you are looking in 3 out of 4 of these important minerals at over 50% share. And it also really goes up when you're getting to cell components and battery cells. So of course, that is partly driven by the fact that China, even domestically, it is the world's largest auto market, and domestically, they have a higher EV share. So that's naturally so. Now, the IRA changed the existing clean vehicle tax credit. The pre-IRA one was $7,500, whether consumer purchased or leased. But it was only for the first 200,000 EVs sold by an automaker. So you might think of it as kind of like an infinite industry thing, but a little strange motivation from an economic perspective, because it sort of almost penalizes success. If you're making EVs that consumers like and buy, you get cut off, and new entrants continue to get the subsidy. The IRA tax credit said, we're going to extend the tax credit for a decade to 2032. It's going to be up to $7,500 on consumer purchases, but subject to origin provisions on battery components and critical minerals. So it's 2 tax credits. And then there's a credit for leases, which you might think of being for the cable company and your landscaping company, but is actually where consumer leases go through. And then one for used EVs. This graphic shows you all of the restrictions that apply to the new tax credit for an outright purchase. So there, again, it's $7,500, but it's really $237.50 tax credits. has to be assembled in North America. Increasing shares of critical minerals have to come from North America, and free trade agreement partners of battery components from North America with no China content as of this year in either part. And then there are caps on price and caps on income in order to limit expense and not subsidize purchases that would have happened otherwise. And then there's the commercial EV tax credit, which again can be used for consumer leases. None of those restrictions apply. Any price, any household income, any origin. So again, Senator Manchin's proposal and all these restrictions narrowed eligibility. It actually initially went from 26 EVs eligible before IRA passed down to 11 immediately after it was approved and into early 2023. In model year 2024 and 2025, which are currently in market, there are 15 EVs eligible. So you've narrowed of eligibility, but you let back in eligibility if the vehicles make the criteria to Tesla and GM, which had already hit their caps. So actually a larger share of vehicles are eligible. And in fact, by my estimates, Tesla got 75% of the EV tax credits on EVs sold last year in the US. So what's the impact been? Whatever happened other than that, I already showed you part of the impact, the number of eligible models. Well, one is EVs are leased at much higher rates than internal combustion engine vehicles. So this is lease penetration by propulsion type. Battery electric vehicles are on the orange line, and plug-in hybrids, of which some are eligible for the tax credits, very few, are on that gray line. So clearly they lease at much higher rates than internal combustion engine vehicles because that created an incentive that if a household or a vehicle didn't qualify for the $7,500 purchase tax credit, the lessor, the financing company could get it and pass it along, drove a lot of purchases towards leases. And this is research from Chad Bone, who's now back at the Peterson Institute for International Economics. All those dashed lines are internal combustion engine vehicles or non-EVs, and the solid lines are EVs. And you can see that the share of EV leases is heavily driven by European EVs in that solid black line and Korean EVs in that solid orange line, that it's those that were not meeting the North American assembly that were being driven in particular to leases. And then there's a question about what happened to domestic investment, because that was a lot of the objective, to create domestic investment in both EVs and batteries. So there's a great website called The Big Green Machine run by Professor Jay Turner at Wellesley College. And you can see here, these are EV investments announced by quarter. And you can see that really there was a lot going on in 21 and 2022 before IRA passed. There's more investment afterwards, but it doesn't look like it's catalyzing that. And for what it's worth, of these investments, over 70% have gone into congressional districts that are currently represented by Republicans. And then on the battery boom, seems to be even larger. And I think you're going to see here that to the left of the IRA passage line, investment starts ramping before, but you really see a ton of that investment, which suggests that more investment in the US may have been in batteries may have been catalyzed by IRA's provisions of that contingency to get the tax credit on battery components and in particular. And here it's even more, by the way, shaded towards Republican congressional districts, with over 80% of the dollars of these investments in districts currently represented in the House by Republicans. Then Catherine's colleagues at MIT CEPR have also been tracking clean energy investments by technology. And here they try to actually get it by when the investment dollars are being spent. And you can see here that batteries are absolutely the dominant investments here. They are the blue section at the bottom of each of these bars. So overwhelmingly, that battery boom is about more than 75% of the clean energy investment boom. And the top of those bars in that orange color are zero emission vehicles. So your BEVs and your PHEVs. Another thing that my colleagues and I has modeled the Trump administration's EV policy overhaul. So remember our Biden chart of carrots and sticks, where the left-hand side here is in law and the right-hand side is executive action and regulatory action. So in his day one executive order on unleashing American energy, President Trump called for the rolling back of a lot of this. Talked about the elimination of unfair subsidies that favored EVs over other kinds of vehicles. Talked about pausing the disbursement of any funding under IRA. Presumably that's more spending, but created some ambiguity, I think, about tax credits, in a 90-day review of the NEVI program, which then subsequently the Department of Transportation called to inform states that they should cease all their investments, and their plans were under review. On the stick side, President Trump called for ending the EV mandate. I would just refer that to a couple different things. Ending the goals of 50% EV sales out of new vehicle sales in 2030, as well as both the Department of Transportation and the EPA have said that they're going to take measures to either ease or eliminate the fuel economy and greenhouse gas restrictions that force automakers to reach a certain percentage of EVs effectively in their sales each year. And then talks about terminating state emissions waivers. That California waiver, which lets them set tighter standards, is followed by 11 other states and Washington, D.C. If they no longer have the right to do that, there would not be that additional regulatory pressure coming from those states with a large share of vehicle sales. So in our policy simulations, we use a model that is from the Cole et al. AER paper and proceedings article, where we have a discrete choice model that is modeling individual vehicle buyers' choice, including their choice of powertrain or EV versus ICE. And it also incorporates charging. And we model, of course, a current law scenario, as well as a variety of different scenarios of policy changes. And so we remove the EV tax credits. We also take away tax credits for business and home charging installations. We basically say, well, cap NEVI at what was already approved. They're actually looks like they're doing something more radical. Take away these tax credits for critical mineral processing and battery manufacturing, and eliminate the California waiver. We also do some combinations, as I'll show you. We do not incorporate tariffs or state incentives. And so the first thing we look at is what happens to EV share of sales in each year, which tells us how many EVs are then subsequently on the road each year. So if you just take away the EV tax credits, that is the single most impactful policy. It would take down the EV share of sales 6 percentage points in 2030 from a baseline forecast of 48%, which aligns with Bloomberg New Energy Finance's pre-election forecast, to about 42%. The next most powerful thing, going over a few columns, would be to eliminate NEVI. That would take it down 3.2 percentage points. If you went all the way and removed all of these incentives and the California waiver, you'd bring the share of sales in 2030 down to 32%, again from 48%, a 16% percentage point reduction. I think that's also worth saying that that's still quadrupling the EV share of sales from 8.1% in 2024. Now, what about the fiscal costs? Well, our analysis says that all the dollars are in the EV tax credit. Over a 10-year budget window, you'd save $168.5 billion if you eliminated the EV tax credits. If you want to layer on anything else, including to the all scenario, you're still only getting to about 173 billion. So if you're thinking about the climate cost per dollar of fiscal savings, all the advantage is actually in the EV credits. We also look at carbon emissions. So we again accumulate the EV sales, figure out how many EVs would be on the road in each year and what the impact on emissions was. And here, eliminating the EV credits would raise emissions in 2030. So this is a 1-year perspective by about 20 million metric tons worth as the baseline. These bigger combinations take you all the way up to about 45. So similarly, the fiscal, you could save all the money from the fiscal costs by eliminating the tax credits with less damage to EV adoption and carbon emissions. So I also want to take a few minutes to talk about how the EV transition could actually improve the US economy's resilience because of that still deep and long-standing tie of oil prices all the way through to consumer perceptions of the economy and actual output. So it is certainly true that large run-ups in oil prices have preceded most US recessions. Obviously, COVID's a big exception. And so you can see this back in the 70s oil crisis, which I think created the psychological framework as well, that higher energy prices induce recessions. You can see it somewhat in 1990-91. It's true in the Great Recession. And Jim Hamilton from UCSD has research that says it's a factor in almost every post-war recession except 1961 and of course for the COVID recession. So this is, first of all, it's been true, even though the US economy has become much more energy efficient, but it's also burned into expectations. Now, since 2020, the US has been a net oil exporter, so it reduces the direct effect on the economy of oil price changes on GDP. But the beneficiaries are more concentrated than those hurt or perceiving themselves to be hurt by higher gasoline prices and energy prices. And consumer sentiment remains really strongly negatively correlated with gasoline prices. And you can see this in this just simple scatter plot of University of Michigan Consumer Sentiment Index against US gasoline prices. These are actually in 1991, $92. But and there's a number of different papers that find that consumer sentiment becomes more pessimistic with rising gas prices. That's from Binder and Makritis. And it's especially true for those who actually remember the 70s. And then there's another paper that finds that aggregate demand and other oil demand shocks significantly influence household satisfaction with economic policy measures. So you still got this link going on between oil prices, gasoline prices, consumer sentiment, and of course, the consumer is about 69% of the US economy. So that negative consumer sentiment can have induced real effects. In contrast, the electricity grid today is about 60% powered by coal and natural gas, the rest being nuclear and renewables. Oil is almost infinitesimal in the US electric grid. And the US is self-sufficient, more or less it's less volatile. So on the left-hand side, that's Brent oil versus US fossil fuels. You can see that Brent is vastly more volatile, and even volatility in natural gas is very short-lived. So the impact on the consumer is low. And in fact, we are big net exporters of both, partly because they are somewhat the more difficult to export or more expensive in relation to price to export than oil. So much more energy dependence. It's also true that natural gas and coal prices in the US are quite delinked from international prices and typically lower and more stable. So using calculations about typical fuel economy and the average miles per gallon of an internal combustion engine and vehicle and the EV equivalent, I've looked at hypothetical monthly average fueling costs for an EV owner who would charge at home and an owner of a traditional gas-powered car. And you can see that the BEV owner enjoys not only much lower, but much more stable fuel prices. So you don't have that volatility in electricity prices that would induce the same shifts in consumer sentiment or downshifts when gas prices go up. So it can help literally stabilize consumer sentiment, stabilize consumption, reduce risk of recession. To wrap this up, EV transition can actually remove vulnerability to oil price shocks, remove vulnerability to geopolitics, really, that can sometimes move oil prices and make the US economy more resilient. And when we shift our transportation energy demand towards electricity, that that also reduces energy price volatility because those prices are more, the sources are more diversified, prices are more stable of each one and less affected by geopolitical risk. EV owners enjoy these more stable fueling costs, which can help stabilize consumption. Rising gas prices simply have an outsized impact on consumer sentiment relative to their role in consumption. And of course, over time, EVs are also powered by cleaner energy sources as the grid greenes. And with that, I'm going to stop sharing and pass it over to Catherine.
Thank you so much, Elaine. Very, very clear case study of the US and the difficulty of, even when the economics are clear, the difficulty of implementing the transition was very nicely illustrated. Thank you. So, Catherine, over to you. You have the floor.
Great. Thanks so much, Helene, and great to see everybody on the screen. So I wanted to start with an overview of where the world is on carbon pricing. It may feel like if you spend too much time in DC that carbon pricing is dead, that everyone hates carbon pricing. But if you look at this map from the World Bank, you'll see that carbon pricing around the world, if not thriving, is at least in existence in a number of countries. So the red countries are countries that have implemented a carbon tax. The blue countries are countries that have implemented a cap and trade system, and the purple are those that have implemented both. The ones that are in lighter shades are countries like India, for instance, where there is an ETS program that's under consideration in the legislature, but has not yet been enacted as law. So this graph is a couple months old. Brazil, since the graph has been made, passed their carbon price, passed their cap and trade system, so that should be dark blue. Canada has received a lot of attention for rolling back its consumer carbon price, but Canada still has a carbon price. And, the indications are that no matter whether Poilievre wins or whether Carney wins, that the carbon price on industry would remain. So one way to look at this is kind of a glass half full, that there are a number of countries that have carbon pricing. In fact, if you look at the G20 countries, all but 3 have some form of carbon pricing, or in the case of India, have carbon pricing planned. And the 3 that don't are Russia, Saudi Arabia, and the United States. So it really, I think, highlights the fact that the US is acting like a petrostate, and the US has more in common with Russia and Saudi Arabia than it does with much of the rest of the G20. So, this makes it look like we are at least making some progress addressing climate change. But this map doesn't show us how high the carbon prices are. And so I think there's a lot of work that remains to be done, bringing the carbon prices up to the level that they need to be at to help address climate change. Of course, carbon pricing is not the only tool in the toolbox to help us address climate change, but it is a very, very important one. Carbon pricing helps incentivize companies to use cleaner technologies, helps incentivize things like, green steel or green aluminum production, or production of aluminum using green sources of electricity. But it also helps send messages or signals to consumers indicating that more carbon intensive goods are goods that are things that consumers should be starting to think about alternatives to. So in the midst of this diffusion of carbon pricing, but at an objectively too low carbon price, given that it's below the social cost of carbon, there's a new policy that the European Union has introduced called the Carbon Border Adjustment Mechanism. And I think that this new policy really has the potential to help address a fundamental nagging problem of global climate change. And that is that climate change is essentially a huge global prisoner's dilemma. So here's kind of a simple representation of the prisoner's dilemma that I like to use with my students, just kind of putting it in the 2x2 framework that people might be familiar with from classes on introductory economics or introductory game theory. Imagine that there are two players. There's the US deciding how much climate mitigation to do, and there's the rest of the world deciding how much climate mitigation to do. So imagine that they have two choices. They can either do a little or do a lot. So for instance, maybe doing a little is having a low carbon price or no carbon price at all, whereas doing a lot would be having a carbon price closer to, 80 or 100 euros per ton as the European Union has. So both of the players face these decisions, and the payoffs to making those decisions are represented by these kind of icons. So basically what this communicates is that the worst possible outcome if you're the United States is to be doing a lot to go through the political difficulties of introducing a carbon price, while the rest of the world is doing a little. The US is only about 10% of global emissions. So even if we reduce our emissions in the US by 30%, which would be, a momentous achievement, but not one without some economic disruption, that would only be 3% of the rest of the world or the whole global emissions. And so if the rest of the world is doing a little, we're still really not addressing the climate change problem. Second worst is for the US to do a little while the rest of the world is doing a little. The best possible outcome is for the US to do a little while the rest of the world does a lot. And this just highlights the fundamental kind of free rider problem that's inherent to thinking about global climate policy, where other countries, every country would like other countries to take the lead and would like themselves to kind of free ride on the activities of other countries. The second best is to have everyone doing a lot, and then we're really making progress towards addressing the harms associated with climate change. So if you assign the same payoffs to the rest of the world and solve this game, you see that it's a dominant strategy for both player to not do much at all, to do a little, and we end up in kind of the classic prisoner's dilemma situation where it would be much better to coordinate and do a lot for every player. But because of this free rider problem, because you worry that you'll be caught doing a lot when everyone else, when your counter player is doing a little, we end up in the prisoner's dilemma. So enter the carbon border adjustment mechanism, which in my mind is the policy that really takes on this free rider problem directly in a way that no other climate policy, at least since I've been studying and thinking about climate policy over the last 20 plus years, in a way that no other policy over that period has. So what does the carbon border adjustment mechanism do? It basically adjusts at the border for a domestic carbon price. So it's been introduced by both the EU and the UK. It's being discussed by the Australian government. It's been proposed by Mark Carney in Canada. And it's something that other countries are definitely thinking about. But let me use the EU as an example, since they're really the leader on this policy. So imagine that the European Union, their emissions trading system, has delivered a carbon price of 75 euros per ton. What the CBAM says is that if you're an external producer, say, of steel, and you're exporting to the EU, you have to pay at the border in a way that equalizes the carbon price that you pay with the carbon price that these domestic producers are paying. But crucially, the carbon border adjustment will credit for any carbon price that has already been paid domestically. So imagine, that the steel producer is located in Malaysia. If Malaysia implements a 10 euro per ton carbon price, then its exports to the European Union only have to pay 65 euros. Or in the extreme, if the Malaysian government puts on a carbon price of 75 euros per ton, then its exports don't have to pay anything. And there are a number of countries that are kind of going through the calculus. For instance, Turkey has done the calculus that over half of its manufacturing exports go to the European Union. So if Turkey puts on a carbon price, manufacturers aren't going to oppose, because they're already, at least those that are sending goods to the European Union, they're already paying that carbon tax. they're just writing a check and sending it to Brussels. Whereas if Turkey puts on its own carbon price, then they can keep those revenues domestically. So the CBAM will start going into effect in 2026. Right now, it's in kind of a transition measurement period, and it will start by applying to this 5 sectors listed here: the steel, aluminum, electricity, fertilizer, and cement sectors. So now let's go back to the prisoner's dilemma and see how having the CBAM in operation, how that really helps address the free rider problem. Because now if you're the US and you're thinking about doing a little while the rest of the world does a lot, you will now be hit by a border adjustment. If you're trying to export your products to Canada, to Mexico, to the EU, then you will be hit with this border adjustment. And so, you know, just to make things extreme, I've made these a big red negative frowny face to indicate that the punishment associated with the CBAM. So this really helps address head on the free rider problem and makes it less potent, makes it less attractive for countries to free ride on the climate activities of other countries. So in this case, we're left with basically a coordination game. You want to be doing the same thing as the other countries. And it's a lot easier to solve a coordination game and get to this better outcome where we're sufficiently addressing climate change than it is to solve a prisoner's dilemma. So that's why I'm so excited by the CBAM, and that's why I think that it really has the potential to help galvanize activity and galvanize climate action in a way that other policies haven't. So that's, you know, all very well and good in theory. What's happening in practice? In practice, I would say that the CBAM it is working almost like miraculously well. It seems to really be driving attention towards carbon pricing and driving interest in countries adopting carbon pricing. So this is a figure from a publication that a policy brief that I published with several co-authors at Resources for the Future and with my former colleague, Kim Klossing. So basically, we're looking at countries that did not have carbon pricing in 2019, because that's when the European Union started talking about what they then called a carbon border tax, but have since either in red implemented carbon pricing, or in light blue or dark blue have it under consideration, or in green have it in discussion. And we're literally just counting the number of countries that have started talking about carbon pricing since the European Union implemented it, or since the European Union started talking about the carbon border tax. And it's up to 44 jurisdictions. So it just looks like there's this kind of wave where we started with like 27 back in 2019. There's this dramatic increase in the number of jurisdictions that have implemented carbon pricing. So this is great progress, but it's not exactly clear the role that the CBAM has played. I think this graph helps emphasize that role a bit more clearly. So what we're doing here is, again, looking at countries that did not have carbon prices as of 2019, and we're looking at the English language news reports from those countries, and then just counting the number of times that the phrase carbon price, carbon pricing, cap and trade, emissions trading system, carbon border adjustment, just phrases related to carbon pricing came up. So you can see before the EU started talking about the CBAM, it was kind of bouncing around at about 500 mentions of carbon pricing words per month. Then when the EU starts talking about the carbon border tax, there's an increase. Maybe that's reporting on what the EU is doing. It goes back down to about 500. But then as the EU plans become firm and they implement their or introduce their proposal in the summer of 2021, and then finally pass the legislation, by now we see that the number of times that you're hearing or seeing the word carbon price in English language papers in Pakistan and in Taiwan, in countries around the world, it's gone up by a factor of 4. And so to us, this really suggests that the European Union CBAM and other kind of related momentum has created and really galvanized a global conversation about carbon pricing. So just to make sure that we're not picking a general trend up in Google News coverage in these countries, this is the green line, which looks at all media hits. It has gone up by a little bit, by about 30% since the beginning of our sample, but by nowhere by as much as the discussion of carbon pricing. So, it's great to have carbon pricing in the conversation. It's great. It's even better to have laws about carbon pricing, but what we're really after is decarbonization. And so this looks at similar media hits on terms related to clean energy in dark blue, green energy in light blue, decarbonization in red, or in green down here, we have mentions of green steel. And again, you see just kind of this upswelling of conversation around these terms, consistent with the introduction of the CBAM. So I think this is what's super exciting, where it seems as though this has really kind of helped push the world into the good equilibrium, where we are more serious about addressing climate change. Just as a point of interest, here is a similar count of the number of media hits of words related to carbon pricing in the US, and it's basically a flat line. So it just kind of highlights this extent to which the US is out of step with much of the rest of the world and not talking about carbon pricing. So that's the good side of the CBAM, that it will help galvanize this action to introduce carbon pricing, and in turn galvanize action towards decarbonization and decarbonization strategies. The CBAM is not without some challenges, so I want to spend a little time addressing those. So there is definitely concern in the trade press, and this has been picked up by the NGO community, about the potential harm that the CBAM will have for low and middle income countries. So these are just a couple of headlines, but basically headlines like these come out almost weekly about how India is seeking exemption from the UK carbon tax, the UK CBAM, or how South Africa is challenging the CBAM policy before the World Trade Organization. Very poignant, the Center for Global Development did a study that calculated that Mozambique, which is a large aluminum exporter, they worry that Mozambique could experience a fall of almost 2% of its entire GDP as a result of the CBAM and as a result of shifts in demand. I think that the term that to me really kind of crystallized this opposition to CBAM is that people have alleged that it's akin to regulatory colonialism. This is the EU making decisions about how to measure carbon emissions and about how to price them, and kind of imposing those on the rest of the world. So together with some co-authors, we have embarked on a study that I think seeks to challenge this global perspective that the CBAM will be bad for all low and middle income countries. And we think that part of where that perception is coming from is the belief that production in low and middle income countries is like less productive, more emissions intensive, dirtier, and therefore likely to be hurt by the CBAM. I think there's also some other difficulties associated with conclusions like the Center for Global Development's conclusion about the impact on Mozambique, because they're not adjusting for either policy actions that the Mozambique government can take on their own to respond to the CBAM, and they're not adjusting for kind of the equilibrium outcomes that will develop after the CBAM, and how we'll likely see higher prices in the European Union after the CBAM. But just to kind of emphasize the point that not all low and middle income producers are the same and that not all low and middle income producers are dirty. This is a plot of the emissions intensity of the aluminum production in a country versus the country's GDP per capita on a log scale. So, for instance, you see that Mozambique, it's a poor country relative to most of the other aluminum producers, but it has quite clean aluminum, particularly when you incorporate the scope 2 emissions. And similarly, Cameroon, Ghana have aluminum production that is cleaner than the average aluminum producers. And so these are countries that we think stand not to be hurt by the CBAM, but in fact to benefit from the CBAM. You can think about the CBAM as basically kind of introducing a world that cares about the carbon intensity or cares about the emissions intensity, and therefore will reward countries that are able to produce the good with low carbon. Then again, India, South Africa, China have dirtier aluminum production than the average, and so it might not be as good a deal for aluminum producers in those countries. So I think that the general conclusion from these graphs is basically that it's a flat relationship between the emissions intensity of the production and the GDP per capita. So we can't kind of unilaterally conclude that the CBAM will be bad for low and middle income countries. So just to finally wrap up and make one final point about what we think the new equilibrium might look like with the introduction of CBAM. This is kind of a simple supply and demand depiction of the aluminum market. Right now, I'm depicting it before the CBAM was introduced. So I'm separating it into two markets because they're going to become separate once we introduce the CBAM. But before the CBAM, there was one world price for aluminum. There's some supply into the EU and some supply to the rest of the world, and demand equilibrates the price so that we have the same price in both markets. After the CBAM, what happens is basically by starting to charge for the carbon intensity of the production, we're shifting or really rotating the supply curve. That will lead to a higher price for aluminum in the European Union. You can think of that as basically like a green premium. And then to the extent that the producers who get priced out of the market in the European Union start rerouting their output and selling into the rest of the world, there will then be basically a brown discount. And so really the key to assess whether a country is likely to be helped or hurt by the CBAM is to figure out, is it one of these countries that's going to get priced out and have to move to the market where they're getting a brown discount? Or is it a company that like, companies that are represented down here, it will receive the green premium and have the green premium be bigger than the additional costs associated with paying the carbon price. So our research suggests that Mozambique, in fact, is in this kind of happy situation where its increase in costs are less than the increase in the price. And so the aluminum producer in Mozambique is likely to benefit from the CBAM. Even more than that, we think that the government in Mozambique, because the CBAM rewards the producer for a carbon price that they've paid domestically, we think that the government in Mozambique could impose its own carbon price and thereby capture and retain those fiscal revenues domestically. And we calculate that those are, potentially a decent chunk of the overall Mozambique government's fiscal revenues. So just to conclude, colleagues and I, working together with colleagues of Elaine's at Harvard and colleagues at MIT, we're thinking about how we can kind of cement the momentum or make sure that the momentum behind CBAM stays in place. And so we've been discussing the idea of a heavy industry what we're calling a heavy industry climate coalition that would basically work like the CBAM with one tweak, which is that we would let maybe low-income countries and middle-income countries access the coalition at a lower carbon price, and so that they would get exempt from the CBAM proportional to this graduated carbon price. And the graduated carbon price is related to some work that your colleague Ian Perry and others have done and published about in 2021. We think that also kind of having the coalition focus on the CBAM sectors at first and not insist that members of the club have economy-wide carbon pricing could be useful. We think that thinking about carrots, thinking about, potentially working with the IFC to help them, encourage them to fund clean steel production or clean aluminum production in lower income countries could be something that would help low-income countries, encourage low-income countries to join the coalition. So I know I've covered a lot of ground, but I'm very much looking forward to the conversation and looking forward to questions as we go from here. Thanks.
Thank you so much, Catherine. That was terrific. It's really analyzing a policy action in real time, right? We're still playing out, and the way you emphasize the spillovers and analyzed it in detail was really super thought-provoking. So before we begin the general discussion, as a reminder in the audience, if you would like to ask a question or make a comment, please either put your name in the chat or your question in the chat, or raise your virtual hand, and you can come in and ask your question. So we do have a question in the chat, and I can read it, or if you would like to come in, you can also come in.
Yeah, I see that question.
You see it, it's for you, Catherine. So do you want to take that one?
Yeah, no, we are not able to differentiate whether it's related to the EU CBAM. I think that would be a valuable additional follow-up exercise. I mean, anecdotally, from my own reading of the press, I myself have been following coverage of CBAM pretty closely. It isn't all reporting about the EU's program or the EU's legislation. It's talking about, maybe in response to the EU, it's talking about how, maybe Pakistan should start thinking about carbon pricing, maybe other countries, the country where the article has been written should start thinking about carbon pricing.
Thank you.
Let me say one other thing. And I guess I also think that so like the increase in the mentions of decarbonization, that's not just talking about what's going on in the EU. I think that's talking about what's happening domestically.
Thank you for that clarification, Catherine. So I have I'm going to ask Dr. Lukusa to come in. You have to unmute. Let me know if you get the message to unmute. I just sent it to you. Not sure why it's not working.
Maybe we could go, I see the other question in the chat. Should we do that first?
Let's do the question in the chat. Yeah, well, we figure out. Yeah.
So the question is about the weak tax administrative systems. Yeah, I think that issue can cut both ways. On the one hand, a carbon tax, especially a carbon tax on the heavy emitting sectors like aluminum, steel, is pretty easy to implement. There are very few taxable entities in Mozambique. There's basically one. Mozal is the accounts for the vast majority of the aluminum production there. And I think this is a little bit sci-fi, but there are ways for other countries to monitor the CO2 emissions. So we've been using data. The data that I showed you on the steel industry comes from satellite imaging of steel plants. And so, I think there'll could be some slippage on the edges, but I think that if a country is vastly underreporting its emissions from a particular plant or from a particular sector, then that's something that could be picked up on the satellites. So I guess just to conclude, I think yes, tax administration is difficult, but tax administration for carbon taxes might be easier than tax administration for other sources of government revenue.
So thank you for that question. I don't see other questions in the chat or raised hands. Would anybody else like to ask a question? Okay. Okay, we have one question from the audience. You have to unmute and come in.
Can you hear me?
Yes, thank you.
Okay, excellent. Thank you. Just another follow-up question on you had a chart, I think it was the first speaker, if I'm not mistaken, but I might be wrong. It caught my eye. You were looking at news reports or news articles, right? To gauge a sense of kind of interest and awareness of this. I think it's also, there is intensity, but there's also coverage, right? How widespread this kind of awareness, if you will, because in some corners of the world, people are not aware of this as a topic, so there is no interest, but in other areas there is intensity in terms of increase. So what I would be interested to see both, right? Intensity, but also how widespread the interest in this topic is, which is important. Even if you look at the United States, it's also very kind of, I would see the interests are very diverse. So, and to really see the kind of the political shift, I would be very much interested in looking at overall US, how the interest overall in the country is rising, for example. I hope I get across what I was my point.
Yeah, no, you're right. We're just counting and averaging all the countries together. So I get your point. Like, is it like there's a huge amount of coverage in one country and it looks like it's happening across all the countries. So you want to know what the coverage is kind of on average by country. I guess I'll say a couple things since you brought up the politics of carbon pricing. I think in some ways the CBAM makes it easier for a local government to kind of blame it on the EU and say, we've got to do this carbon pricing in response to them. It might be kind of too quick or a little bit of a higher price than we would ideally do, but the European Union has this law, so it doesn't feel like the government is taking a step that might be viewed as negative, but rather they're doing it because the EU and other countries are doing it. That they're doing it as a way to kind of keep up with what the rest of the world is doing. But yeah, I hear your point about the intensity as well as the kind of total count across all the countries. We should look into that.
Thank you, Catherine. Oh, did you want to add something?
No, I saw the new question in the chat about making up for the US
Oh.
policy.
Yes, I was gonna ask maybe both you and Elaine to speak to that because there's yeah, I think it speaks to both of your presentations.
Yeah. Yeah. So the US has very obviously and very kind of publicly withdrawn from climate negotiations. In a strange way, I think that this could help really galvanize momentum in the rest of the world. And I think that for two reasons. I think, as I emphasized in my presentation, carbon pricing is kind of uniquely challenging in the US and Russia and Saudi Arabia as well. But basically every other developed country has a carbon price. The US doesn't. And so taking the US out of the equation lets other countries really focus efforts around carbon pricing without kind of jumping through hoops to accommodate things that are kind of like carbon prices, but really aren't, like the US policies. And I think for a second reason, the fact that Trump is imposing these tariffs and would ideally, from Trump's perspective, like to have bilateral negotiations with every country. Like he's trying to do that with the law firms and the universities in the US. Like it's better for him if he can peel off an individual country and try to kind of bully that country. But if other countries come together and say, look, we are part of this climate coalition, we are not going to change our policies on steel and aluminum because like we're all doing it together. I think that can give some useful or provide a useful counterweight to Trump on the tariff front.
Very good. Elaine, what are your views on can other zones, Europe, Asia, make up for the loss of momentum in the US?
It certainly would put more pressure on them. I guess the one, because the US's reduction in carbon, the US's expected future carbon emissions will be higher if we remove all the policies designed to address the externality. I guess that the silver lining is that I don't think or maybe it's not quite a silver lining, but we have to keep in mind that we don't stay at current levels because the technologies continue to progress. Installing renewable generation is generally less expensive than fossil fuel generation today. On EVs, battery costs will continue to decline. And we probably will see EV internal combustion engine cost equivalents later this decade. And so the US will continue to progress, but less rapidly than it would have with policy support. I think it does, it has the potential to make some countries find the negotiations easier without a complicated the US in the middle of them. On the other hand, it may help some governments back off their commitments. So we'll have to see how it actually plays out.
Yeah, I guess one follow-up thought on that. I also think that if a bunch of other countries got together and have carbon pricing and have CBAMs, that will get the US's attention. Like US doesn't need to pretend like it is an island unto itself. It can feel the pressure from other countries. So, Canada and Mexico start putting CBAMs on, I think even a Trump administration would see the logic there. Like, we've got to put our own domestic carbon price on. Otherwise, we're writing checks and sending them to Mexico and Canada.
And to be clear, I agree with Catherine with respect to CBAMs. More broadly on climate, is where I think it's messier. But I agree, and especially given the Trump administration's focus on trade deficits, CBAMs that would reduce US exports would get their attention.
Yeah.
And Catherine, Paolo has a question in the chat on whether the coalition of countries you spoke about, is it specifically for CBAM? And if yes, can you elaborate a little bit more?
And hi, Paolo. I met Paolo a couple of days ago in Mozambique, so wonderful to see you on the line. The way that we're envisioning it is that it would start with the CBAM sectors, I think politically it's easier to address sectors that are far upstream, like aluminum, steel. We saw from the Canadian election how it's difficult to have carbon prices on like retail gasoline, but they seem to be sticking to their carbon prices on the heavy upstream industries. So that's why we're focusing on those. And then I went through this quickly, but we are imagining it kind of following the IMF proposal as there being, you could join the coalition as long as you had a minimum carbon price. So for the low-income countries, the minimum carbon price would be around $25 a ton. But that's just a minimum. I think that in Mozambique's case, for the aluminum sector, it makes sense to have, like, to match the European Union, because you get credit for that when you're exporting, and because that's, the aluminum producers are going to pay the higher carbon price when they export to the European Union if they don't pay it in Mozambique. We think that for countries like India and China, because they have dirtier production, we think that kind of having the credit for a lower carbon price might be attractive to them, to help them incentivize them to join the coalition. But the idea is that it would start with the CBAM sectors, but I really think that if you have kind of this coalition that forms, you have governments, you have ministries of finance that start talking to one another about implementing carbon pricing, that eventually the discussions would hopefully expand to other sectors as well.
Very good.
Yeah. Okay.
Go ahead.
No, that's fine.
We still have time for questions. We have 5 to 7 more minutes. So if anybody wants to ask a question. Yes, I see one in the chat. Just going to read it. As we enter a more protectionist era for global trade and policymaking, do the two experts remain optimistic that other countries will band together to push for environmental goals, such as CBAM or broader emissions targets? So this is for both of you. Thank you for that question.
I mean, I frankly do. I think that the benefits of trade are so apparent. I think that the global financial markets reaction to Trump's tariffs is, a very poignant indication of just how valuable trade is to all countries. How US markets are down, Asian markets are down, everyone is imagining suffering at the hands of these tariffs. So yeah, you're right. It may be an optimistic view and not a kind of middle of the road view, but I tend to think that the world will appreciate the values of trade, and with something like CBAM, appreciate the values of addressing climate change. As we experience more and more extreme weather events and floods and just destruction at the hands of climate change, I think the urgency to take action becomes more and more real.
So I still buy the view that trade relationships are helpful in providing foundation for foreign policy and other relationships between countries, and that the increased difficulty, the reduced volumes that many countries may see in exporting to the US as a result of tariffs will make them more interested in tightening trade relationships with other countries. And that can strengthen the foundation for other agreements that they might reach. It's not perfect, right? There will be exceptions where trade relationships won't tighten other relationships. I think we can all think of clear examples there. But I think it can strengthen cooperation among other countries to try to work together on trade and other things in the face of a high tariff and more isolationist US.
Okay, thank you, Elaine. We have a a question that in the chat from Alan. Thank you for the excellent presentations. Do you expect geopolitical challenges and trade wars will affect the pace of expanding the CBAM sectors to less energy-intensive sectors under the EU emissions trading system by 2030? I think that's for you, Catherine.
Yeah, I definitely watch European politics. I can't claim any expertise in predicting what will happen with European politics. You know, I think we hope that by emphasizing the good parts of CBAM and pushing for some kind of coalition agreement around CBAM, focused on the CBAM sectors, that this will kind of make it apparent what the huge benefits of CBAM are. And so that will help the European Union expand the ETS and expand CBAM down the road. But yeah, I think anything predicting the future is dangerous business, and who knows what will happen to the European economy and European politics.
Great. So we have one other question in the chat from Dhruva. I hope I pronounced your name correctly. On how comparable are the new and innovative carbon-free energy sources, such as solar, compared to white energy sources, and comparability in terms of cost? Do you want to take that one, Elaine?
Yeah, I'm happy to take that. So at the moment, solar and wind, even at sort of utility scale, are much less expensive than white hydrogen or other hydrogen production. So white hydrogen being hydrogen sort of coming up from the ore core. That may change over time, but I think at the moment, the discovery of large amounts of hydrogen in the Earth's core that might be able to run it is a powerful and interesting one, but I don't think we yet have affordable technologies on that. And we'll have to see how fast innovation is. Right now, solar is the least expensive technology in most of the world.
That's an interesting stylized fact.
One more
wouldn't
thought
have guessed.
You know, on the hydrogen, the attraction of something like hydrogen is that there's no intermittency. It should be 24 hours a day, and regardless whether it's windy or sunny. And that is part of the incentive to continue to explore the technologies for extracting that at lower costs. Hydrogen's also complicated in terms of transmitting it from one place to another and transporting it.
Okay, and so we're almost at the end of our time, but just maybe one last question from me, coming back to your initial slides, Elaine, where you mentioned the current administration's response to the credits given for electric vehicles as being, I think, unfair or undeserved. So I guess my question would be, would this electric vehicle diffusion in the economy, would that happen without these credits? I mean, how important are those incentives? It's a very naive question.
No, it's not. And I mean, that's one of the things that's in our policy brief. And for those interested, I put the link in the chat. But EV adoption will continue, but it'll slow the pace because one of the key considerations for consumers is the price differential between an internal combustion engine or gas powered and vehicle and an EV. And if you take away the EV tax credits in particular, the gap for most purchases will expand by, for many of them, between 3,750 and 7,500. Probably more and more vehicles under current law, more and more vehicles probably would have over time been made to meet the requirements and get that tax credit. So you've got a bigger price differential, you'll have lower adoption, but you'll still have rapidly increasing adoption. And again, if you just took away the EV tax credits, we would project that we go from 8% of US new vehicle sales being EVs in 2024 to 42% in 2030. If you took away all the policies, the sort of most extreme scenario policy change, you'd still be getting to about 32%, so still quadrupling adoption. There's still a lot of forces that will make EVs an increasingly attractive option for consumers, both on narrowing price gaps just on technology, as well as a wider range of offerings in the market with longer ranges that make them more perfect substitutes with gas-powered cars.
Perfect. Well, it's now 15 minutes after 60 minutes after the hour, so time to close the seminar. Let's have a round of virtual applause for our speakers, and thank you to everyone who contributed their views today and your questions. So I wish everyone a great day, and see you soon. Bye-bye for now, and thank you, Catherine and Elaine. Fantastic insights.